Welcome. So this is the last of 4 parts of Chapter 13. This one focuses specifically on the role of monetary policy, and it's relevant to something that we've experienced in the U.S. and many other economies more recently as a result of the financial crisis, which is how to deal with the condition where you're at the zero lower bound. So specifically, what does monetary policy look like when we hit that zero lower bound? And so the first point is to think about what the ZLB, or zero lower bound, actually is. And so the basic idea is this is simply the point at which nominal interest rates hit a floor of 0. And so the idea is that nominal short-term interest rates can't go below 0. In fact, in general, all nominal interest rates really can't go below 0, because the basic idea is that the nominal rate represents a rate at which you can borrow from in dollar terms. And so if you had a negative nominal interest rate, effectively that would mean that you're paying somebody to hold your money for them for a period of time. And so that just doesn't make sense, because you'd be better off just holding the money yourself rather than paying somebody to hold the money for you. And so that's why it doesn't make sense for nominal interest rates to go below 0, and therefore why we have this zero lower bound. Now, I should preface this by saying that the distinction between nominal interest rates and real interest rates is really important here. And so what we'll see is that real interest rates can in fact go below 0, and occasionally do, but nominal interest rates, we're assuming, cannot go below 0. And so that's an important distinction. And so this zero lower bound, it actually causes quite a lot of problems for a couple of reasons. So first of all, conventional monetary policy doesn't work. So in the sense of, we think about the typical way in monetary policy operates with the Fed in particular, where the Fed is adjusting the short-term nominal interest rate, which is the Fed funds rate. We've hit that zero lower bound, so in essence the Fed can't adjust the nominal Fed funds rate. It has to do other things, and we'll see what those other things might be later on. But there's a second, perhaps more crucial problem, which is the fact that the self-correcting mechanism is actually destabilizing. So once we get into this condition of a zero lower bound, then it turns out that if we don't do anything, if the government doesn't do anything, if fiscal policymakers and monetary policies don't respond forcefully, then it can actually be a lot worse, and you can go into this destabilizing, debilitating sort of spiral, not unlike what we've seen in Japan over the last several decades. With a deflationary spiral. So the first thing to understand when we think about the zero lower bound is how it relates to monetary policy. So we're going to look at what the MP curve looks like at the zero lower bound. And so this zero lower bound, again, very simply means that the nominal interest rate is equal to 0. So we hit that floor on nominal interest rates. And so the idea is that as nominal interest rates go down, in this sort of Fisher effect world, we would expect that inflation would be falling as a result of that. And so at some point, there's going to be a compression between the nominal interest rate and the inflation rate. Now, inflation can go up or down. It can be positive. It can be negative. It can be 0. It doesn't matter. But the point is that as inflation goes, excuse me, as inflation falls, it's going to compress the short-term nominal interest rate lower and lower and pin it more towards 0. So at some point, there's some arbitrary inflation rate, which we're going to call pi star ZLB, which at that point, that pins short-term nominal interest rates at 0. Okay, so once inflation falls at or below that pi star ZLB, then we're going to be at the nominal interest rate of 0 and that floor of 0. And so in particular, what that also means is that, if you recall, our real interest rate is just equal to nominal interest rate minus inflation. So once our nominal interest rate is equal to 0, that just means that our real interest rate is equal to minus whatever the inflation rate is. And so the real interest rate, once we hit that 0 lower bound, is just going to be equal to minus the nominal interest rate at the 0 lower, minus the inflation rate, rather, at the 0 lower bound. And so the punchline here, which is really important, is that once we hit that 0 lower bound, then as inflation goes down, the real interest rate is going to rise. And that's really important to understanding this ZLB. Again, once nominal interest rates hit and get at that 0 point, then as inflation goes lower with the minus sign there, that means real rates are going to rise. That means investment becomes more expensive. It's more expensive to borrow, and that's going to excuse me, that's going to have a contractionary effect on aggregate demand. And so this is what the MP curve looks like at the ZLB. And so to understand this, again, the idea here is simply that with this MP curve, it sort of captures the effect of how monetary policymakers would respond with nominal and hence real interest rate changes as a result of variation in inflation. And so as an example, if we were sitting at point A, as inflation falls, you can see that we just move down along this given MP curve, and the Fed reduces the nominal interest rate as a response to the lower inflation, which means the net effect is going to be a lower real interest rate. But at some point, inflation might get so low to the point where it pins that nominal interest rate equal to zero. That's the inflation rate that corresponds to the zero lower bound. And that's where the trouble starts to occur. So at point B, we're assuming we're hitting that zero lower bound. Nominal interest rates are going to be pinned at zero. So suddenly, we're in a situation again where the real interest rate, if this is equal to zero here, the real interest rate then is just equal to minus the inflation rate. And so as inflation falls, the real interest rate is going to rise because monetary policy can't do anything to affect short-term nominal interest rates. And so that's where you get this segment from point B to point C. As inflation falls further below that threshold level pi star ZLB, the real interest rate is going to rise rather than fall. And again, intuitively, that means it's more expensive to borrow in a contractionary environment, which means that demand for goods is going to fall off, and that's going to be further destabilizing. And so once we hit that kink part, as inflation falls further, we move up along this upward sloping point of this MP curve here. So what does that mean for aggregate demand? Well, not surprisingly, if you recall back in Chapter 10, we derived our aggregate demand curve from the MP and IS curves. So now that the MP curve has this funny shape, it turns out that our aggregate demand curve also is going to have this really funny shape, okay? And so, again, if the way we follow this is, if we look at our MP curve here, we're starting off at point A at inflation pi A, okay? And suppose that inflation falls, and it falls to this threshold level where we hit the zero lower bound, okay? And so up until that point, the Fed is going to be reducing nominal interest rates, which is going to be driving real interest rates lower. And that means that if we look at this IS curve, that means that the real interest rate is going to go down from RA to R star ZLB, okay? And so that's going to be pushing us from point A to point B. There's our interest rates right there. And so in this case, so far we're okay. The real interest rate is declining, which means planned investment is going up, which means planned consumption, if that's sensitive to interest rate effects, that's also going to be rising. And then we also have the net export effects in there as well. All of that means that output is going to be going up from point YA to point Y ZLB, okay? So the punchline here is exactly what we've seen before. When inflation falls, the real interest rate goes down, planned spending goes up, and output goes up. And so that's this standard story that we've seen in previous chapters. We move from point A to point B, inflation falls from pi A to pi star ZLB, okay? But then the trouble starts when we get from point B and inflation falls further. Keep in mind, we've hit that zero lower bound. And so what that means is that as inflation falls further below that threshold level of inflation, these are going to be pure real interest rate effects. Nominal interest rates can't go below that. So as inflation falls further, real interest rates rise, which means that we go from a point like point B to point C. And that drives real interest rates back up from R star ZLB to RC. And so that coincides with here going from B to C, the real interest rate rises from R star ZLB to R star to RC rather. What that means is that suddenly we sort of reverse course on this IS curve and we move back up the IS curve. You'll notice that output falls from YZLB to YC, okay? And so the trigger was we went from inflation level pi star ZLB to pi C. That had this effect on the MP curve in a funny way. That reduced planned spending in the economy from YZLB to YC. And so what we get then is with this reduction in inflation from here to here, output goes down from YZLB to YC. And so you get this kinked aggregate demand curve as a result of this kinked MP curve, okay? So again, this highlights the limitations of the MP curve in the sense that, number one, it sort of limits the ability of monetary policymakers to respond appropriately. But number two, it also highlights this failure of the self-correcting mechanism. So that's the second sort of problem that's arisen as a result of this. So if you imagine a situation where our short-run equilibrium is at a point along that funny kinked part of our aggregate demand curve, then that's where the trouble starts. So in the basic self-correcting mechanism story, if output is below potential in the short run, then you're producing below capacity. That puts downward pressure on costs. Inflation expectations fall. As inflation expectations fall, that pushes us back towards aggregate supply curve shifts down, and that pushes us back towards our potential level of output. But in this case, we don't get that, and the reason why is if we're below potential here, again, that puts downward pressure on the cost of produced goods. Inflation expectations fall. As inflation expectations fall, our aggregate supply curve drifts downward. But as our aggregate supply curve drifts downward, that pushes us farther away from our potential level of output. Not closer, but farther. And it all has to do with that kink demand curve. Again, the idea is that as inflation falls as a result of the drifting down of our aggregate supply curve, well, that means that real interest rates are rising more, which means planned investment is going down, which means planned consumption and planned net exports are also going down. And so the demand, the total amount of aggregate demand, quantity of aggregate demand of goods is decreasing rather than increasing. So it's getting us farther away. And so you can see that this sort of builds upon itself as in the sense that as we get farther and farther away, then the aggregate supply curve is going to drift down more and more, and that gap is going to widen even more. And so this problem can become very destabilizing as a result of this zero lower bound condition. And so then the question is, well, how do we get into such a situation in the first place? And so the basic idea is that under normal circumstances, you would expect the economy to be in a situation like point A, and you might have sort of standard shocks that are going to be pushing and pulling the economy around one way or another, but they're not going to be big enough to permanently push inflation to a low enough level to get near that threshold. So under typical demand and supply shock type of conditions, you wouldn't expect the economy to have to deal with the zero lower bound threshold. So the only time you really get into this problem is when you have severe, significant, sharp, large drops in aggregate demand, which are going to sort of permanently push inflation and inflation expectations lower as a result of that. And so that's when you get these significant shifts to the left of the aggregate demand curve to the point where longer run inflation ends up getting low enough to where you hit that threshold level that pins our nominal interest rate to zero. And then beyond that, then you get into these problems that I talked about before. So in this case here, you know, we can think of it as a financial crisis or a sharp reduction in government spending or tax policy or autonomous spending or something like that. All of the above, in fact, would have the effect of dramatically shifting aggregate demand to the left. And so you can see our equilibrium. We start off at point A here in this normal sort of environment, and then we end up at point B. And so in this point B, this is where the self-correcting mechanism kicks in and is destabilizing. And so that's a significant problem as a result. And so then the question is, once we get into this, and because of the fact the severity of this condition is so dramatic, the question is, what can we do? How can we get out of it? And so there's two sort of answers to this. First of all, you can do a whole lot of fiscal policy, which I don't mention in these slides here. And so you can do massive increases in government spending and or massive tax cuts. And we saw a little bit of that as a result of the financial crisis and the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2007, 2009. Here, we're going to focus on the role of monetary policy. And so the point here is that with conventional types of monetary policy, the Fed funds rate, in particular the short-term nominal interest rate, doesn't work. We've already hit that interest rate of 0. And so what that means is that we're not going to be able to do anything with conventional Fed funds rate policy. And so what that means is that we need non-conventional types of policy changes in order to be effective. And so there's 4 basic types that I'm going to go through here and talk about in terms of the ability to potentially get the economy out of that 0 lower bound condition. The first is what's referred to as liquidity provision. And so we can think of this as direct funding of malfunctioning financial markets. And so we saw this as a result of the financial crisis in 2007 and 2009 and beyond, where the Fed was pumping liquidity into certain segments of financial markets through directed lending programs and whatnot. And so the idea is that it's going to reduce financial frictions. And if you recall, the important point of thinking about how interest rates affect the economy is not just the interest rate that the Fed sets, which is this safe interest rate that we call it, or the interest rate on safe debt, but it's also the effect of financial frictions. So if we put both of those things together, that determines the real interest rate for investments. So the interest rate that firms face, for instance, for borrowing. So it's not only the interest rate that's set by policy in safe debt markets, but it's also the effect of financial friction. So this liquidity provision is designed to directly affect financial frictions, lower them, and thereby lower the ability for firms to access credit to compensate as a result of this. So the idea is that it helps to lower the credit spreads, or the difference between what interest rate firms face and the interest rate that's set by policy through the safe debt markets. And then the second type of non-conventional policy is what's referred to as asset purchases. So we can think of this as the LSAPs, large-scale asset purchases that the Fed has done and many other central banks around the world recently. So, for instance, with mortgage-backed securities, these purchases of mortgage-backed securities and other agency debt can lower financial frictions and also lower credit spreads in the same way that I just mentioned. When you have a decline in F bar, then that leads to a decline in the real interest rate on investments for any given safe interest rate. And the second point is that we can buy treasury purchases, treasury securities, so U.S. government debt. And that has the impact of reducing the interest rate on safe investments, which is considered the benchmark interest rate. So we can think of this as simply the policy interest rate that the Fed can control. That's, again, this thing, that thing right there. And so the idea is that if the Fed is buying up treasury securities of various maturities, that's going to be lowering the real interest rate on safe debt. And so for a given level of financial frictions, that's also lowering the real interest rate for investments, that is the actual interest rate that firms face at any given level of financial frictions. So there's two ways that they can attack it even within asset purchases. The third point is quantitative easing, and the idea here is simply increasing the size of the assets of the balance sheet of the Fed. And so the idea here is that this can come either in the form of liquidity provision or in the form of asset purchases. But the distinction here between quantitative easing and the outright asset purchase effects itself is that with the quantitative easing, the idea is that a larger balance sheet can put downward pressure on real interest rates independent of the flow of purchases. So in other words, if the Fed stopped buying assets altogether, but held a huge amount of assets on its balance sheet, it would still have the effect of putting downward pressure on real interest rates now and into the future. And so that's the idea of the quantitative easing here, is that it ends up, again, reducing the safe interest rates and lowering the real interest rate for investments for any given level of financial frictions. And then the last piece of this is what the textbook refers to as management of expectations, or is also more popularly referred to as forward guidance. And so the basic idea is this is the way that the Fed or central banks communicate with the public, and that has implications for potentially affecting real interest rates today through impacting the expected path of future policy. And so the idea is that with this forward guidance story, the central bank can commit to a policy path in the future which enhances the policy at the zero lower bound. And so that can come in two forms. So first of all, the Fed can lower the long end of the yield curve either by committing to purchase assets into the future, okay, or it can also commit to keeping short-term interest rates low now and into the future. And so the basic story of this, which might go a little bit beyond the scope of this course, is that the expectations of short-term future interest rates are linked to current long-term interest rates. So if you commit to keeping future interest rates, future short-term interest rates low, that's going to have the effect through what's referred to as the expectations of the term structure. That's going to end up reducing the real interest rate on longer-term debt. And so that has the implication of reducing real interest rates on the longer end of the yield curve. And then the second point is that we can keep inflation expectations elevated. And so this is referred to by a famous economist, Lars Svensson, at one point, being responsibly irresponsible. So at the zero lower bound, one way to lower real interest rates is to increase inflation expectations. With a given nominal interest rate, if inflation expectations rise, that pushes real interest rates lower and pushes back against this zero lower bound problem. And so with higher future interest rates, that helps lower real rates with nominal rates stuck at the zero lower bound. And so if we put all of those things together, the basic idea is that in some way or another, those non-conventional types of policies are going to move us away from this substandard equilibrium where we face the zero lower bound to an equilibrium like 0.2, where suddenly we're in a more normalized sort of policy environment where we don't face this particular zero lower bound. And presumably if our aggregate demand curve increased a little bit more, then we would get into some more safe equilibrium here where we're completely away from that zero lower bound threshold on inflation and nominal interest rates. Thank you.